Great. I'm thrilled to have Chris Daw QC with us today. For those of you who came into the early part of the conversation, you may have thought we booked Bear Grylls by accident because Chris was just recounting his escape on foot from Russia. So before we get going and talking about things legal and developmental, just please confirm or deny that you weren't that person in the Ukraine-Russia delegation with the baseball cap pulled low over their eyes.
No, that wasn't me. No, I mean, it was, so my girlfriend's father lives in Russia, and he sadly is going through chemotherapy and it's not very well at the moment. And so we made a dash to try and see him last week. We actually left a week ago today, on Wednesday of last week, to fly to Russia to see him for a few days. We were due to fly back on Sunday night. So the timing was quite extraordinary when you think about it, because we arrived on the Wednesday and the Thursday the invasion began. Not that the Russians call it an invasion, of course, but the invasion began on Thursday. But we were told all the way through over the next 2 or 3 days, there's no problem, flights are still operating. And we were on our way to the airport on Sunday afternoon when I got an email from Finnair to say that all of the flights out of Russia, foreign airline flights, were all cancelled. So we had absolutely no way to leave the country by air. We weren't allowed as foreigners to leave the country by train, which would have been an option if we were, but only Finnish and Russian people were allowed on the train into Helsinki. And so it turned out that the only route out of Russia for foreigners on Sunday night was, and bearing in mind our visa ran out at midnight on Sunday. So the only route out of Russia on Sunday night was on foot. So we had to get a car to take us to the border, go through various Russian checkpoints and so on, with armed soldiers all the way, checking who was leaving the country and why. And eventually we got to the border with Estonia at a place called Narva on the other side. And thankfully, the Russians let us leave. But it was a bit of a checkpoint Charlie moment, really, because you walk through and you get through the Russian side, and then you have to. I don't know if anyone's ever been on the border between Russia and Estonia, but you then walk across a bridge, and you have to get to the other side. There's a river underneath, and you have to get to the other side, to the Estonian side. And then you have to get through passport control there. But it was one of those moments where I thought, I've seen all the movies from the Cold War. You just never know. Someone's going to say, "Oh, actually, come back before you get through the checkpoint at the Estonian side." But it's quite extraordinary, the difference between the two sides. Which, I mean, it was the first time I've ever been to Russia. And we were in St. Petersburg, which is probably one of the most spectacular and stunning cities on the planet. But right now, it's a very strange atmosphere out there, not least because on Sunday afternoon, we were having lunch in a restaurant in St. Petersburg that was full, and people were just having lunch and living just ordinary, going about their lives as if nothing was happening in the world. And it was only, as I say, an hour or so after that we were told, you can't leave the country. It took about 4 hours to find out how we could leave the country. But thankfully, we had a lot of very kind Russian people, including our driver, who was incredible, spoke to all the soldiers on the way, made sure that we were going to make it and so on. And, he and a number of others, including people who Russian staff at the hotel, were very worried for us. And I have to say that I thought the Russians that we dealt with who were helping us leave the country were some of the kindest people I've ever met. And it was quite extraordinary, and many of them just do not understand what's going on in their name, or don't consider it to be in their name. But yes, it was something of an experience. But serendipitously, we ended up in Tallinn, which is also one of the most beautiful cities I've ever been to. And we ended up having 22 hours in Tallinn, which probably sounds like a novel. Enjoyed that very much. But the relief was more important than the experience of knowing that once we were in the EU, we could go wherever we liked. And just a few hours before, we couldn't go anywhere apart from over this bridge.
So, I mean, you have a book out at the moment. See, I got the plug in early, which everybody who has come to this session and is registered for it will get a copy of. But does this mean, and we'll come to that in a little bit, but does this mean that your next book may actually be inspired by 24 hours in Tallinn and escape from Russia on foot? You see, and when you said you escaped from Russia on foot, I thought, wow, this is going to have done your step count, your daily step count.
I think we're at 18,000 on Sunday. No, we were very lucky that my girlfriend's father lives in St. Petersburg, which of course is in the far west of Russia, and only a couple of hours or so from the Estonian border. Had we been in Moscow or further east, we would have had absolutely no chance. There would have been no way to get out, and our visas would have expired because, as I say, at the moment, as a British person, you can only get a visa for the number of days that you're booked in to stay in a hotel, and then the visa runs out. So our visa expired at midnight on Sunday, and we crossed the bridge at 10:20 p.m. So we had about an hour and 40 minutes before we would have been illegals in Russia, and I have no idea what in the current climate what that would have meant, but I don't think it would have been much fun.
So, as I said, we're delighted to have Chris with us today on so many levels because we almost didn't. Now, you referenced, you've seen all the movies. You found your way into the law, but one of the first sort of forks in the road was the acting profession. So,
yeah, it was a fork that I didn't take. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, the only reason I'm here is because when I was just by way of background, I went to a very ordinary sort of state comprehensive school in a place called Milton Keynes, which some of you may have heard of, but most of you probably won't have done. Very sort of slightly strange place in the very centre of England, not really famous for anything except roundabouts. So I went to a very ordinary state school there, and most of my friends, and I was on a journey to leave school at 16, as most of my friends did back in the 80s. And just by sheer weird coincidence, my parents decided to move up to Merseyside, and I went along with them because I tried the summer of selling ice creams and donuts on the beaches of southern France, but found that was quite tiring and not very profitable. So I ended up with no money and went back to where my parents had moved to, and just by sheer coincidence, they'd moved right next to one of the best state sixth form colleges in the country at the time. And I ended up going there and doing A-levels. And so getting back to your question, Keith, it was halfway through my A-level course. So I was just 16, 17, when I did one of these computer careers tests where you put in what you like and what you don't like, and it prints out what your future career looks like. And in my case, it said there are only two jobs for you. One's actor and one is barrister. So I didn't really, obviously I knew what an actor was. I didn't really know at that age much about what a barrister was. My dad was a builder, and we had no kind of lawyers or professional people in the family. In fact, no one had been to university in my family at that point. So I went to court because I wanted to find out what the computer was recommending. I went along to the criminal courts in a Crown Court Centre where the jury trials take place, and I just sat in the summer holidays and watched these amazing trials with the barristers wearing the wigs and all of the sort of all of the stuff that people will be familiar with from TV drama. And I just fell in love with the whole thing. I fell in love with like criminal law in particular. Although subsequently and more recently, I do a much wider variety of things. But at the time, I just found the whole, it basically, being a criminal barrister in Britain, in England rather, and doing jury trials with all of the drama and the pomp that comes with it is not that different to being an actor, to be honest with you. So I ended up combining the two routes that the computer had mapped out for me. And from that moment onwards, I literally spent, and now we have, well over 30 years later, my whole life has been dedicated to pursuing that career that the computer gave me back in 1986 or 1987. So, and it was the right decision. I love it as much now as I did, as I did, the idea of it then when I was just watching other people do it.
And you say you love it, and I want to talk about, maintaining a love for the law. In fact, throughout this mentor series, what's interesting is I always ask this question: how did you find your way into the law? And the people who've come to it. We've had farmers, sons and daughters of shopkeepers. It's all sorts. There's a complete spread. Most people falling into it one way or the other. There tends to be an element of serendipity to it, but then finding that it becomes it's more than a vocation. It's a calling. There's a passion there, and it that sustains people through the ridiculous hours and the challenges and the setbacks. And it's interesting that you say you sort of married your twin paths in one, actor and barrister, and the overlap is quite strong. But you're now also on TV. You've done a series for the BBC. You're sort of constantly on talk radio and an interview thing. Is that the actor coming through, or is that just you using, I suppose, your influence and where you are in life to have a broader influence?
Well, it's a very interesting question. It may be a more interesting and appropriate question for the seniority level that are on the call, because I, like many professionals, I suspect, and certainly many lawyers, I qualified. I was 23 when I became a barrister, and for the first 5 or 6 years, it was just relentless and non-stop, as it is for most lawyers in that period of your career when you just qualified or you're doing your training, and you're piled with work, and by those more senior to you, and it's a relentless kind of period where you're learning the ropes, you're learning how to actually do the job in practice rather than the theory that you may have picked up at law school. And so suddenly I'm 30, and I've been doing it for 6 or 7 years, and my career is going very well, and so then I sort of went up and up in terms of the nature of the cases I was doing, the success. I had considerable levels of success in my 30s, but then by the time I was sort of between probably about 15 years or so, I reached that point where I started to think, do I really want to do this exact same thing for another 30 years, potentially, exactly the way I do it now? And so what I did, in fact, I think it was about 36, 37, is I took a year out, and I went and did a sabbatical year. I set up a company with a friend of mine in financial services, quite an interesting kind of area of financial services. And so I spent a year working full-time in the business, and I'm not doing any cases, I'm not practicing any law. And then I came back into the law after that year, and suddenly it was almost as if I reset the clock back to the age of 23 again. And I suddenly realized how lucky I was and had been to have had that computer all those years ago tell me what career to do, but to have the sheer good fortune to be able to be part of this profession, because it's just, it's so exciting and so rewarding and so exhilarating, but it can end up feeling quite relentless. And I think our profession, perhaps as much, if not more than most, is a profession where burnout and kind of a level of kind of getting to a point of feeling that, I've done everything I want to achieve, and do I really want to carry on the same? So I know many people, I'm sure, don't ever feel that, but I did. And I came back then in my sort of late 30s, and my next goal at that point was to become a QC. So I set myself a sort of 5-year target, which I beat by, I think, a year or so, to become a QC. And those who are not familiar with the English bar and the system, I suspect most people are, but the QC, or Queen's Counsel, as you know, Keith, is the very sort of elite level of English barristers, sort of worldwide sort of badge of quality, which we've retained, despite many attempts to get rid of it, in fact, for that very reason, that those coming to Britain who don't know anything about the legal system and may need lawyers, and they know that a QC will offer them there's a certain guarantee or assurance that you're getting someone who's considered to be at the very top of their game, and so on. So and then after that, with the benefit of being a QC, come lots of offers. People suddenly get in touch and say, as happened with me, would you like to write a book? And if so, what would you like the book to be about? And in my case, it was Bloomsbury who approached me, who also published Harry Potter, amongst many other things. But sadly, my book hasn't sold quite as many copies. But a really prestigious publishing house just coming out of the blue. And I don't think they would have approached me if it wasn't for the fact that I'd managed to become a QC by that point. And likewise, I was approached by, as you mentioned, Keith, I think it was about 3 years ago now, by the BBC to make a documentary series about crime, justice, and punishment, which I did. And so opportunities came along to diversify my career in other directions. So partly, I'm sure some of that were, as you kind of suggest, was I like the performance element of the job, and I really enjoyed learning a completely new skill set of making a television program, because there was the technical side of it, the production process of commissioning and everything that goes with it was a completely new world to me at the age of 46 or 7 as I was then. Completely new world, and most people I don't think get the opportunity in their sort of mid to late 40s to do something totally new. And so within a year or two, I'd gone from having pretty much just practiced law as well as running the business I mentioned, to as you say, making a well-received television series, which anyone who can access BBC iPlayer, you can still watch it. It's called Crime, Are We Tough Enough? And it's available, certainly available in the UK, and it may be available in other places where the BBC content can be found. And the book was very successful, and it's interesting. So and really, I suppose, in line with the topics and the general kind of mentoring element that we're talking about today, I've actually today been in discussions with my publisher and my editor about a next book, which is I'm looking to write a book where it's going to be a business book effectively, but I'm going to be taking all the lessons I've learned from being an advocate, a criminal advocate in particular, all the courtroom strategy, the preparation, the engagement that you have to have with clients, witnesses, and everything else. Take all of that skill set and write a book which applies all of that to the business environment and the business world. So for people who are looking to make a career in business, there are a lot of lessons that I learned from my career at the bar that I then applied when I spent some time in business. So I've crossed over between the two. So and I guess all of this, from a sort of mentoring point of view, I just didn't want to just do the same thing for 40 or so years. And now I have half a dozen or so different activities. I'm also involved in exec producing a TV drama about, funnily enough, the main character is a QC, but surprisingly, but I'm involved in a wide range of projects, which I find really interesting, and which are not my day job.
And do you think, again, coming back to the sort of mentoring aspect and a message to the younger up and coming lawyers, is there almost a subliminal message of hope? Is, look, it's tough right now. You're in the thick of it. You've got to earn your spurs. You've got to put those ridiculous hours in. They to some extent, they never go away, but you get to an age and stage where you're able to be, and everybody on the call is solicitor rather than barrister, but you get to an age and stage where you can be a little bit more selective about what you involve yourself in. And I suppose you have the financial security to choose other projects.
Yeah, and I think the real lesson for me is that you don't have to be a one-trick pony. You don't have to just do the thing that you originally qualified in for your whole career. I mentioned that I came out of the law and did something completely different. My media and projects all have some connection with, I draw upon my experiences to feed into the television and the writing and everything else. But I think it's really important. I think many people, when they're into that middle stage of their career or towards the sort of middle to later stage of their career, often lack a sense of, what's my next challenge? I've reached partner potentially at a prestigious firm, and I have, as you say, I have a good income. I have, may have had a family, and they may have grown up and all growing up. And what's the next challenge? And I think if had I not done different things for the last sort of 15 years or so, I'm not sure I would have still have that passion that I had when I first started. The excitement I had when I was first qualified. So back in those days, again, some of people on the call may be familiar with this, but as a criminal barrister, you used to get your brief wrapped in pink ribbon. Yes. So, you know, and it would come, you know, and in those days, you know, that we didn't have, I mean, nowadays, all of my, I don't have paperwork. Everything is on my laptop or on my iPad. But in those days, it was still paper. And so the thrill of seeing in my pigeonhole in my chambers, the new brief with the pink ribbon, fresh piece of pink ribbon around it, was so exciting that you can't maintain that level of excitement about one thing forever. I mean, I am very excited. I had a call the other day while I was in Russia, funny enough, from a solicitor to say, you know, we've got this really interesting case and we'd like you to instruct you. And we had a conversation about it. And I love that, you know, every time a new case comes along, it's still very exciting. But I just think that we can get a lot more if we're prepared to try things that are outside our comfort zone, you know, where there's a possibility we may fail. I mean, I could have made a TV series and that could have been told it's rubbish and actually it's not even good enough to put on TV. I mean, these are the sorts of chances that you take when you do something that is completely different to the thing that you have all of your experience in. But without that risk, without being willing to take that risk of possible failure or if not failure, of mediocrity, which in some ways is worse, I suppose, you know, without being willing to take that sort of risk, you just end up, I think, living in a comfort zone, which for me, I just don't think is what we're lawyers by definition. I think we tend to be interested in the world. We're interested in what makes people tick. We're interested in how you take a problem and solve it, you know, whatever the area of practice we have. So we have all of these kind of skills. But I think we can use all of those skills to do a whole range of things in a way that certainly legal practice wouldn't have allowed 30, 40, 50 years ago, where people were very much in tram lines. You know, it was this is your career. You go from here to here, and at some point you'll probably get a gold watch when you retire and go and play golf. But now you can do, you know, a whole range of other things, particularly in this virtual world that we have, where you can engage with people from all over the world as we're doing now. So I just think, you know, that's a message, you know, just try something new at some point and you'll get that spark of enthusiasm that we always had when we first started out in the job.
And talking about trying something new and also about failures, let's talk about one of your failures then. Your failure as a stand-up comedian.
Well, yes. I mean, that's the one thing. So I did bits of that when I was a student, and I guess that's the one kind of thing I'm really jealous of, because I think being able to do stand-up comedy to a high standard is something really quite extraordinary. The ability to take an entire audience of people on a journey and make them laugh, make them think as well as make them laugh. And sadly, I just, I gave it a couple of goes. Having said that, I do still have quite a few notes, and I think I've got the makings of a solid half hour. But what I might do, in fact, is go and do my solid half hour somewhere like Boston, where the sense of humor is not dissimilar to the English sense of humor, but nobody will know who I am, and it won't matter if I crash and burn.
And possibly not quite so relevant in court.
It depends. There are barristers I know who use humor constantly through cases. I think it's a difficult judgment call. Yeah, you have to make sure it's very funny if you're going to do it, because if it falls flat in the context of a criminal trial where someone's looking at going to jail for 20 years, that's really not the place to fail as a comedian. So, and I've seen barristers try humor in their closing speeches, or even in the course of cross-examination or talking to the judge. And if it works, it can be very successful, but it's a high-risk strategy. And I try to avoid it because I just don't think, and most of the time, it works too well. But what I will do, if there is something funny witnesses, as I'm sure everybody will appreciate, witnesses do come out with things which are, really quite strange sometimes, and quite funny. And when I'm defending, we sit as the defense barrister, we sit right next to the jury, often 2 or 3 feet away from members of the jury. And when you hear the jurors sort of sniggering and laughing and sometimes kind of almost ducking down, you can kind of ride that wave a bit and use that, so I'll look at the jury, and then if one of them's looking back at me smiling or shaking their head, then, these kind of little psychological kind of cues and shared humor can actually be quite a good way of bonding with the jury and getting a sense of commonality with the jury, which ultimately is what you need to do if you're going to win the case. You need the jury on your side. So however you get them on your side, sometimes it can be those subtle things. Sometimes it can be that you just have a brilliant argument and you make a really good point. But humor we use, but I've seen it go very badly wrong, and I think the more sensitive the case, the less room there is for humor. In fraud cases, they're quite dry and often quite dull and often go on for months. And frequently I see jurors who can barely keep their eyes open because they're being referred to page 1412 of the bundle, and it's another bank statement or another email about transaction, and they were hoping they were going to get a nice murder case, but instead they got 3 or 4 months of documents. So in those cases, I think there's a real they're the cases where you can try and bring it to life a bit with some humor. But in a sensitive case, like for example a murder case or a sensitive case involving someone who's been hurt or harmed in a really serious way, I think there's much less room for that, because people would find it quite distasteful, I think.
And also it's about knowing your strengths and weakness. If you've got half an hour's worth of material in a case, well, it's not really going to fly. You talked about you've talked about the pink ribbon and sort of the love, the excitement, the sort of love of the tradition in some ways. But you're also a challenger in terms of your book is challenging the criminal justice system in the UK. You've talked about closing prisons, legalizing drugs. Some people, you've got friend and foe. How do you marry the traditions of English law or the law with you being that challenger and innovator?
Well, it's good. It's interesting. You make a good point, which is one of the other reasons why I was excited to be asked to write the book, was because when I'm doing my day job in court, there are very strict rules about what we can and can't do. We're governed by the rules of evidence. We're governed by, the law of the land. And, I can't say to the jury, well, he's guilty, but, let's be honest, it doesn't really matter because, use your common sense or just be kind to him because he doesn't deserve to be punished. I mean, we can't make these kind of points because the judge would immediately say, members of the jury, ignore what you've just been told because it's not the law and that's not how it works. But when you write a book, as I did, I can say whatever I like. And so I spent most of 2019 or a large chunk of 2019 both writing the book, but also traveling around the world to research the book. I described quite a lot of the US justice system. So I traveled around the US, particularly in the Deep South, in Alabama, to see how criminal justice was being dispensed down there. And then I went to countries in Europe, Switzerland, and various other countries where things are done very differently from the way that they're done in the US, but also very differently to the way that they're done here. In Britain. And so I guess, the great thing about the book is that I could say what I actually think because I'm not restricted by what I'm allowed to say in court, and no one can tell me off, So I do strongly believe that most of what we do in our criminal justice system in Britain and in the US in particular is fundamentally flawed and wrong and doesn't achieve the primary objective of a functioning criminal justice system, which is, in my view, should be to reduce crime and to make society a safer place. That's what criminal justice should be about. The truth of it is, when you look at Britain and the US in particular, our criminal justice systems do the opposite. We inflate the level of crime, we criminalize and marginalize certain sectors of society, often on racial lines, it has to be said, both in Britain and in the US, whereas other countries have a much more pragmatic approach in line with the objectives that, as I say, that I believe the system should have. So it was quite exciting to me to be able to sit down and say, well, what are we doing wrong? And identify what I believe we're doing wrong. And I say it by we, I mean we, probably mostly in the English-speaking world. because, the British justice system, the English justice system was exported to the US, and it's taken its own course there, but it was exported to Australia and various other places. So many kind of aspects of our system, are seen either, in one way, shape, or form in those other English-speaking countries. And I thought, well, these are the things we do wrong. We send far too many people to prison, particularly at a young age, and we criminalize, young people to the point where they find it almost impossible to get out from under, to get out from their early mistakes, if that's the right word, or early behaviors which were criminalized. Other countries, I mentioned in the book, like Luxembourg, they don't criminalize anyone under 18. There is no, you can't be considered a criminal in Luxembourg until you've reached the age of majority, when you're allowed to vote. So at the same point that you're allowed to vote, you become subject to the responsibilities of the criminal law. Now, that's not to say they don't act to protect the public from violent children, and there are a tiny number of them. But so it was the way we overuse prisons, and the US is the most extraordinary example of the overuse of prisons, with 2.5 million people in prison in the US at any one time, which dwarfs our mere 80,000 in Britain. But in Britain, we have the highest level of incarceration in Western Europe. So it just shows you just how extreme the positions are between different cultures. And as you point out, Keith, our kind of war on drugs, which was started by Richard Nixon in the early 70s and taken up by the British government in the early 70s as well. It's been a catastrophic failure, and has led to, so many unnecessary deaths, so much crime in our society. I think one of the most interesting statistics for me, it's a tragic statistic, is that we had the Misuse of Drugs Act introduced, which rather like the US system, just brought in these classifications of drugs, very long sentences for drug supply. And at that point in time, in 1971, there were only 1,000 in the entire country, people who were problem heroin users, who had a heroin addiction. And in 1971, within a decade, we had 300,000, directly because we had criminalized heroin in the way that we did. We had stopped people with heroin addiction getting access to medical treatment and medical grade heroin, and we created this vast market where the drug dealers were just getting anyone they could to take heroin. And that 1,000 to 300,000 in a country the size of Britain in just a decade, it just immediately made me realize. And, the same happened in the States with the crack epidemic, the meth epidemic that there is in the States now, and the whole problem around drugs. But I think the most important thing of all, Keith, and everyone on here is going to get a copy, so they can have a read if they're interested. But the most important thing, and I've kind of alluded to it already, was the fact that we do in Britain, we criminalize children as young as 10-year-olds can be taken to a criminal court and tried for murder or any other crime. It doesn't happen very often, but it's just a principle that a 10-year-old, I have a 10-year-old daughter. It's just ridiculous, the idea that she has the maturity and the wherewithal to kind of navigate the world in a way that should make her criminally liable if she does something which would be a crime for an adult. And that, to me, and in some US states, there's no minimum age. You could prosecute a 5-year-old, and again, it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen that very young children are prosecuted and criminalized in the US in a way that just doesn't happen in most of Europe. Or even in Saudi Arabia, they have a minimum age of 14 before you can be criminalized. So, we're even behind Saudi Arabia, at least in that regard, not in many others. But anyway, so you can probably gather, everybody, that I got quite excited writing this book because I was able to say all of these things, and no one could stop me.
And you'll all get a chance to read it, and then come back and actually, put your questions to Chris at another point, having read the book. If we go, if we pick up on the idea of childhood and you as a child and sort of your journey, you now, with the position you're in, looking back at yourself as a young lawyer, what, if you're able to go back in a time machine, what are the things you would say to that sort of up and coming lawyer that again may have sort of resonance to the people on this call?
Well, I think I would say that you are entitled, not only are you entitled to take breaks, but they're good for you. They're good for your development because, you know, I spent probably 5 years where I barely had a week off in the whole 5 years, and really didn't and just worked 7 days a week. Now it was good for my career in one sense, you know, it allowed me to progress and, you know, prove myself and develop a practice. But on the other side of the coin, I don't think I was particularly well rounded at that stage. And I think, I think, you know, if I could sort of tell myself at 24 years old that you don't have to work 15 hours a day, 7 days a week in order to succeed, that I think would have, you know, it may have taken me a little longer to progress along the career track, but I think I would have had a much more rounded and balanced life, which I think would have helped me in numerous ways. And I think nowadays we are moving away from that. You know, not many firms are not, but we are. I think we are accepting that there's a need for work-life balance, as it tends to be called, in a way that was just unheard of. I mean, that phrase, I don't know when it started, but certainly no one used to talk about work-life balance when I started, and people would have just laughed at you at the idea that somehow there was virtue in not working all the time. But actually, I think that's a lesson over the years that I've learned is, one, take breaks, you know, get away, switch your brain off from the day job and from the law on a regular basis. So every week, you know, not just, you know, come up for air and have a holiday every few months, but, you know, where you kind of go away, lie on the beach, and then come back and do the same thing. You know, I think, you know, having a variety of things going on in your head, doing other things. You know, I love cooking. You know, it's just small things, but things that that give you pleasure. You know, if you're a bit of a perfectionist, as many lawyers are, you can apply that to something else like cooking or whatever it might be. And it doesn't suck the life out of you in the same way as relentless perfectionism about your job, your practice, your cases can suck the life out of you. So I think that will be, I think nowadays younger lawyers are more aware of that. You know, we're more aware of mental health, of course, which is another side to that coin, if you like, of balance. You know, that people can often work themselves into a situation where they are, you know, their mental health is significantly impacted and stress levels are very high. And someone's buzzing to get in, to get in. Can I have 10 seconds? I think the children come home from school. 1 sec.
Please. While Chris is letting his children in, I'm asking all the questions. I'm quite happy to do that. I have more questions to ask Chris. But in the 20 or so minutes we've got, if any of you have any questions, either use the raise hand icon or put something in the chat, and Meryl and I will pick them up and feed them to Chris. And as you've already gathered, you know, he's not shy. He's very eloquent. So any questions at all, you know, I'm pretty sure he'd be happy to answer. So I was going to ask you how you cope with stress, but you sort of answered that in terms of it is by taking breaks. It is by turning that energy and focus, and I'm gathering a bit of perfectionism into,
and being willing to say no to things as well, because I'm, you know, I it's harder. The more junior you are, it's quite hard to say no to things. But the more senior you get, you can say no. And I just say, you know, if I don't have the capacity to do everything that everyone's asking me to do, I just say no to something. You know, it's like I operate a kind of constant triage system, or rather my PA does most of the time, but it's a constant triage system of what's essential to happen, must happen today, what actually doesn't need to happen today, but maybe can happen in a week or a month, and what doesn't need to happen at all because it's a net drain and it actually doesn't achieve anything for the client and it doesn't achieve anything for me. So I think that, you know, constant triaging of your own time and priorities. You know, many of us in the more senior levels, as I say, have assistants and have other administrative staff who can, you know, take some of the load and field, you know, things that may not be priorities. But I think that's really, really important. I think I can't remember when I first said no to anything, and it's a strange thing. So certainly wouldn't have been for the first 10 years, at least 10 years of my career. I would have just said, if someone said this, you know, we'd like you to go to, you know, my clerk said, you've got to go and do this hearing in this place, I would just say, okay, I've got to go. That's what happened. You know, it has to be done. Whereas now, you know, I wouldn't do that. Partly, I have to say, because we have the luxury of the technology that we're using here. You know, if I back in my younger days, you had to travel sometimes halfway across the country for a hearing that would last 10 minutes, and then halfway across the country back again. And complete waste of time and quite soul destroying in many ways. And of course, that was pre-internet. So there were limits to what you could do along the way in terms of work and so on. Whereas now, you know, I work very efficiently. I mean, even when I was in and out of Russia or wherever I am, you know, I can keep up with work in a way that's much more efficient and isn't sort of just creating sort of dead time because I say yes to everything. I just don't do that anymore. And I think that's, I mean, I appreciate that. Very difficult for a junior lawyer who has a partner supervising them and telling them, you know, you've got to do this. And I totally understand it. But I think firms need to have in mind that they need to make it possible for younger and more junior lawyers to say, you know, do we really need to do this? You know, to question the status quo and to question received wisdom as to how things are done. And I think, you know, I always, when I'm managing a large case, you know, with many millions of documents and a team of 12 or 15 lawyers, I always make sure that the younger and more junior people, they may not even be qualified, but just ask them what they think. You know, what do you think about this? And when you give them the freedom and the safety to express their opinion without fear of being sort of put down or criticized for it, which I think is really important and often doesn't happen, sadly. But when you enable more junior people to be completely open about their opinion, I think 8 times out of 10 they have really good ideas. And the other 2 times where they maybe have missed the point a little bit or they don't really fully understand the dynamic because of inexperience, then you still have to kind of justify your own thought processes, but you also teach them. So I think you know, but I'm you know, it's not a statistical science, but I would say 8 out of 10 suggestions that come from junior members have some element of being useful and change the way in which the more senior people approach the case in a way that, you know, when we're all just speaking to each other and we've all been doing it 30 years and we all think we know everything, we just tend to reinforce each other's and reinforce the way that we've always done it. So I think that's a really important learning thing. And I've seen that in business and I've seen it across a whole range of areas where enable bright young people, bright newcomers to the profession, enable them to actually express themselves when they have an opinion. And if you do that, you'll get enormous value from them.
Well, as you say, one, potentially you get a freshness of perspective, you get a new way of looking at things, you get an idea, but also you get the teaching opportunity if they have got something wrong, and then you won't know that unless they express an opinion, and they won't know to express an opinion unless they feel there's that psychological safety to be able to do so without being put down or judged, and that actually they will be heard and guided if necessary, or have their idea put on a platform and taken forward and supported.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because I think there is a tendency amongst a certain kind of mindset of senior lawyer that, you know, I haven't got the time to listen to everybody's opinion, and I already know the direction of travel in the case or over the issue, and I think that's a big mistake. I mean, one of the most rewarding things that I did in practice, and I deliberately did this, you know, in anticipation that it would give some reward, was taking on a pupil barrister, which is the equivalent of a trainee solicitor. And I had a pupil for a full 12 months, and he shadowed me for the first 6 months. Everything I did, he was there. He was in court for every hearing. He was in every client meeting. He reviewed every document that I drafted, or indeed I asked him sometimes to do first drafts and so on. And I have to tell you that I learned more in that 12 months than he did, because you learn more about why you do things rather than just doing them because you've got used to doing them that way. And when you have to explain to somebody who's never done it before why we're doing it, I would often find myself halfway through a kind of this is why we're going to make this application. And I'd look at him and he'd be shaking his head. So I still don't understand why we're making the application. And after about 5 minutes, I go, you're right. I don't know why we're making the application. It doesn't make any sense. Why are we doing that? And so by, you end up challenging yourself when you engage with people who are learning. And I, after that year, there were numerous things I did differently as a result of interacting on a daily basis with someone who had almost no experience. And it's extraordinary what you can learn from people, because their lack of experience gives them open-mindedness and freedom to think and express themselves in a way that most of us in later practice kind of lose the habit of doing, because we're just on the, we're in a routine and we believe that things are done a certain way. But there's always room to do almost anything marginally better than you did it before. So, I mean, there's a famous cycling coach in Britain called Dave Brailsford, who coached the British cycling team to about 8 gold medals in the Olympics. And his philosophy was just that: marginal improvement. If you can, change the aerodynamics of a bike by a tiny little bit, it might give you 0.1 second a lap. And when you add all those 0.1s up, you end up with, you've got a gold medal, and you would have come 7th if you didn't do those tiny little things. So I think that philosophy of marginal gain, marginal improvement, looking for opportunities to do things a little bit differently and a little bit better, which, when you think about it, that's what evolution is about. That's why we're here, because we evolved, because there were slight changes in behavior which were advantageous and, led to the development of every form of life on earth. And so I think you can apply that to your professional life and get a lot out of those marginal improvements.
So I want to talk to you about the sort of the evolution that's happened in the world and the legal industry in the last couple of years. But just before we get onto that question, then, when coming back to when you took on your pupil barrister and when you do your mentoring work, what are you looking for in young, sort of younger people, young talent, young lawyers?
I think enthusiasm more than anything. I think if someone's enthusiastic, then most of the other elements required will take care of themselves eventually. And that's not to say that absolutely everybody is suitable to become a specialist criminal barrister or a specialist commercial lawyer. There are kind of fundamental skills and fundamental personality traits, I think, which are kind of essential to be able to do certain things within the job. But I think there are very few who completely lack the qualities required amongst those who have the ambition to do it. So I'm really looking for people to be highly enthusiastic and not lazy, and not kind of lazy either in their kind of behaviors or in their thinking. So that to me, I think, is really important. So I'm speaking to a group of school students this afternoon at about 4:30, and I do that probably at least twice a month, sometimes hundreds, sometimes just a small group of aspiring lawyers in one school. And it's amazing. I can immediately tell on those sessions which of those young people, and some on the call today will be 16 or 17, the age I was when I kind of first had that aspiration. I can tell the ones who really have got that level of enthusiasm. And it's quite extraordinary. And the number of times I get direct messages or emails from 16 and 17-year-olds saying, could you spare the time to have half an hour with me just to talk on Zoom about my career aspirations? And that takes quite a lot of confidence to reach out to somebody you don't know, who is, fairly high profile in the profession and very senior, and ask for their time. And I find that really is a quality, that a willingness to put yourself out, to take a risk. I mean, sometimes I get messages from parents who say that my daughter or my son's really interested in being a lawyer. Will you give them half an hour? And I'll always give half an hour of Zoom kind of mentoring to people, and I probably end up doing 8 to 10 a month of that. And it's any more senior lawyers, I think, and I can see that there's a number on this call. You get an enormous amount out of doing that because the satisfaction of. And once again, when a 16 or 17-year-old says to you, well, why do you do that? Or how can I do this? They ask with such complete open-mindedness. There's no kind of attempt to kind of already judge the answer, already kind of navigate what the answer might be. And then you think, I've actually got to give them come up with an answer to a question I've never been asked before. And that I find that incredibly rewarding. I just wish my own children would ask me more questions, because but yeah,
very happy for you to put your own children, feed them into the lion's den of the Mackrell International sort of lawyers, and sort of, let them ask questions. You didn't quite put it this way, but I've heard you talk before about when you're looking at people, there's a tendency, particularly within the law, to or the legal sector, to look at accolades and achievements, but you're very careful about and sometimes there's a tendency, therefore, to take the silver spoon rather than the scrapper, because it's easy. They seem to have gone to the right schools, they've gone the right grades, they've had a year off, sort of volunteering in Kenya, and all that's very lovely, but they've come from a privileged background, potentially, not always, and some of that's been easier for them to do than the person who has stacked a supermarket shelf and done various other things. And I think probably because of your background, you're quite active about a little bit of leveling up.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I do work with the Social Mobility Foundation and with Speakers for Schools, which is an amazing charity that as the name suggests, arranges for speakers from a whole range of walks of life. I mean, I spoke in a school, and they had someone every year from Speakers for Schools, and the year before it was someone who ran a Formula One racing team. So it's not just law; it's just anything that's going to engage young people. But you make a good point. I mean, I was asked, one of my kids asked me a couple of months ago, what jobs did you do before you became a barrister? And I realized I think I had 17 jobs before I even went to university. So, and talking about milk rounds, paper rounds, and so on. But I worked with my dad on building sites for many years in summer holidays and so on. And I worked on the chicken farms, sorting eggs. I mean, these intrinsically, it might not sound like particularly good building blocks for practice as a lawyer, but I think, when I interview for scholarships for Gray's Inn in London, and we get a really quite eclectic mix of candidates, but I would say that 60% plus went to private schools and have never had a paid job of any kind. They've never worked in any paid employment at the age of 23. And so they're not even a bar job at university or anything, because they didn't need to. And so I'm not saying you have to have had those experiences, of course. And, there's many different reasons why people perhaps don't. But when someone, so I'll give you an example of this. So when I was interviewing for Gray's Inn scholarship about 3 or 4 years ago, when we're doing them face-to-face still, I had a young man from Singapore. And he had been a barman during his whole time at university and had worked in bars, in hotels and so on in Singapore. And I said to him, can you make a Singapore sling? And he said yes. And he told me exactly how to make it, what the ingredients were, what the process was. And I remember that, and I'm telling you that story. I don't remember most of the things I was told by the ones who had done the Kenya thing or all the other things, identikit experiences of privileged sort of middle-class life. I struggle to remember any of them, but I remember the ones who did something different, that stood out, and who were not embarrassed or ashamed to talk about it. They're actually, quite open and willing to talk about it. And of course, when you think about it from a scholarship point of view, they're the candidates we want. Scholarships are not supposed to be just a badge that says I'm very clever and I got a first from Oxford. A scholarship, by definition, is intended to give someone a leg up. And at Gray's Inn, we give scholarships of anything up to 30,000 a year for the year of doing the bar exam and accommodation and so on. There's no point giving that money to someone who doesn't need it. And so I absolutely look for candidates who show enthusiasm, but also kind of lived experience, and actually sometimes having it quite hard and needing to, work hard in order just to get through their studies. So I don't. It's not so much a question of actively discriminating in favour of people who come from a similar background to mine, But it's often the case that those are the candidates who most merit a scholarship, who most merit one and need one. Whereas those candidates who've come from wealth and privilege don't, and they don't need it. And I'll tell you a story. It's quite extraordinary sometimes. So honesty and integrity are really important as well when it comes to candidates and young people. So I was interviewing a scholarship candidate, and we had a panel interview. There's three of us that do the interviews. And we had a candidate from a very wealthy background, young woman who'd gone to a very, very expensive private school. And one of my colleagues on the panel said, so you've said on your application that you're inspired to become a barrister by reading about the great advocates of the past. Can you just give us an example of one of them and why that was so inspirational? And she just laughed and said, oh, I just made that up because I thought it sounded good on the form. And, it's just, and we're all sitting there, and she'd come from this vastly wealthy background, and we were just thinking, what planet are you on? We've got people coming in here who would give their right arm to get into this profession, and you treat it like a joke, like it's something funny, because you have this utter sense of entitlement that you can have whatever you want, and you don't even have to tell the truth to get it. So I think that kind of integrity, honesty, but most of all, just a spark of enthusiasm and life and kind of energy. Those are the qualities that I think are far more important than a first-class degree from Oxford, where the odds of getting there from most backgrounds are next to nil. There are exceptions. There are very exceptionally bright young people from very poor backgrounds who manage that journey. But the truth of it is, it's so much easier to do it if you come from privilege. So I try and neutralize those factors and look at the individual.
We've got a couple of minutes left, and so if anybody wants to ask any questions, please jump in now. If not, I touched on it a second ago about sort of evolution, very big word, and this is too big a question for 2 minutes. But what do you see having changed for the better? Let's focus on positives in the last couple of years. You've talked about within the legal sector the ability to work anywhere. Do you think that's true of the judicial system? We talk a lot about Zoom fatigue and the fact that you're now sort of relentlessly pursued by the laptop camera. Although again, that's a question of saying no and making time and booking 50-minute Zoom calls, not hour-long ones, so they don't end up back to back. So there's things you can do to control. But I suppose, what do you see as a sort of positive evolution in the last couple of years?
Well, I do think remote working, to a significant degree, has created freed up time that was previously taken. So my life before COVID was, I would spend a lot of my time either traveling to client meetings or waiting for clients to arrive. They'd be late because of traffic or all the other kind of factors that we're all very familiar with. And I think I can work more efficiently in terms of the use of my time when I work remotely. And I think the fact that we've become used to it, I think it's a really important point you make, Keith, which is, I've done 12 Zoom calls in a day, and I don't think that's very good for anyone, back to back in particular. But I think there is a need to kind of ration your time, even though in theory, as I am, you're just sitting in your kitchen or wherever, and and you can, don't have to wear a suit and tie and so on and everything else. But I think that we have been freed up a bit. We have to make sure that we use our time wisely. So far as the judiciary is concerned, I think many judges haven't got with the program. Frankly, they still expect to see you turn up in court, even for a short administrative hearing, which could so much more easily be dealt with by video, and avoid all of those hours and hours of unnecessary travel, unnecessary, even just going through security to get into the court buildings and things like that. These are part and parcel of life as a lawyer, but I think the system could learn a lot from the last couple of years in terms of making the most of technology where we can, and avoiding unnecessary hearings. I mean, there's so many hearings that take place where I actually don't think they're needed at all. And I think if people were to be more streamlined in the way that they interact with the other side, or whether the way they interact with the judges. So there was a time, I remember a few years ago, when a High Court judge, I sent him an email, obviously copied in my colleagues on the case and my opponents and so on, said, I don't accept emails from counsel. Why are you emailing me direct? This is totally not appropriate. And I see it as being, completely inappropriate. Now, I think most judges, I would say, welcome counsel emailing them saying, we can probably reach agreement on this. We can avoid the need for a hearing. These are our proposals. We've agreed them. I think that kind of pragmatic approach to court process and to litigation, and looking to reach agreement when you can, rather than always assuming that everything has to be an attritional battle with the other side. I think trying to be pragmatic and looking at ways to find solutions rather than constantly finding problems and constantly making things as difficult as possible is probably something I think that we've learned a bit from, and we need to carry forward into the future.
Brilliant. Chris, we're going to pretend we're on the Radio 4 Today program, and they do that thing where they say last word and your time is running out. So last word, piece of advice for the up and coming lawyers, as opposed to people like Lynn in Tokyo. Thank you for staying up for us, and Caroline in Kuala Lumpur. We appreciate it. So last word for the Dans, the Kates, the Sarahs, the Paulinas, the Harriets, the Joannas, the Jimmy show. And I know you're kind of, on the up and coming. And Tom, I know that there's a little bit of seasoning there as well. So last word for the up and coming lawyers. Last piece of word of advice.
Enjoy it. It's fun. Law's fun, and it's a great career. It's an exciting career, and enjoy it. And don't be afraid to enjoy it. Don't be afraid to focus on the things that you find most enjoyable, and pursue those as your career progresses. It doesn't have to be a slog. It doesn't have to always be relentless. So enjoy the whole journey, and make sure that you make time to let your brain kind of occasionally decompress and go surfing or skiing or whatever the other thing is that you do. Just enjoy the journey, because you'll be amazed, those who are in the generation that you've just talked about, Keith, you'll be amazed how quickly you get to our age.
I'm going to take that piece of advice, and when Dan and Sarah and Joanna, Harriet and Paulina looking frazzled, I'm just going to say, are you not entertained? Enjoy it. Chris, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you for making it out of Russia in one piece for us. We appreciate that as well. Thank you everybody for joining us today. And it'll take a little bit of time to get to some of you. And I know Elaine is thinking, hang on, how are we going to post things to these parts of the world? But we will get Chris's book to you as well, for some brain fodder and for that enjoyment. And of course, if there's any questions, I'm sure we'll find a way of feeding them back to Chris on the UK criminal justice system, legalizing drugs, all of the above. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks a million, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Keith.
Take care. Stay well.